All right, so we've spent the last 6 weeks now going through in agonizing detail all the trouble in the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And it has been a heartbreaking story. Let's just review really quick. So we started by telling the story of a woman named Naomi. And she had a husband and 2 sons, a family. And they all together left their home, the town of Bethlehem, the house of bread in Hebrew, because there was no bread. There was no job, there was no food, there was no hope in Bethlehem. And as we told this story, some of you kind of raised your hand and said, I've been there before. And then we told the story about how this family left Bethlehem to go to Moab, this place with dysfunctional relatives and lots of conflict. And many more of you began to relate to that and said, hey, I've been there too. Then, after all that, things began to get worse. Her husband died. And then you may remember her sons get married, but then her sons die. And Naomi finds herself lost. We see Naomi depressed and in despair. And a lot of us identified with that. We heard the story and we said, well, I've been there too. And of course, Naomi's only bright spot in her whole life seems to have been that she had 2 daughters-in-law. And you may remember these verses where we talked for a couple weeks about how she had chesed love for her daughters-in-law. She was convinced that she was going to go back to Bethlehem, but her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, should not go back. In fact, they should go back to Moab because while Naomi's life seemed to be over, they still had hope. And then we saw Ruth make this amazing commitment that Ruth would somehow cling to Naomi to the death and beyond. And what we observed in looking at what Ruth said is that Ruth loved like she was able to because she placed God at the center of her loving commitment. And as we told that story, I think all of us said, wow, I don't know if I've ever been there. That is an amazing display of love. And last week, Naomi and Ruth go back through the gates of Bethlehem, back through the gates, the same city gates that Naomi once left full with her husbands and sons. And now Naomi comes back through those gates alone. Her name is now bitter. She is angry at God. And what we said last week was that Naomi's fundamental frustration with God was really driven by faith. She was angry with God because she really, really believed that God was both good and powerful, but the reality of her situation didn't match what she believed was true about God. And as we talked about that frustration, the frustration that comes from that sort of faith, I think a lot of us heard that and we thought to ourselves, and some of you actually said this, I've been there before. I have been frustrated with God. And I heard this from a bunch of you. This is good. I identify with this story. And I heard this from a bunch of you. When are we going to get to the good part of Ruth? Because if you know anything about the book of Ruth, you know that this is a very big story. You know that Ruth ends up being in the line of King David. And Ruth even makes a cameo in the Christmas story. So you know whatever happens next in the life of this woman, Ruth, is going to be big. And think about it for a second. If you didn't know this story, if you'd never heard the story of Ruth, I'll bet you might expect whatever happens next to be just extraordinary. Because God does the extraordinary, right? God does burning bushes. God even does stuff with widows, right? Remember when Elijah, in God's power, raises the widow's son from the dead? Remember that? I mean, how cool would that be, right? If God did that for Naomi, if she brought back Ruth's husband. I mean, how cool would that story be, right? Or even, I don't know, Exodus, where God sends food from the sky. God can do stuff like that. Or at the very least, I mean, don't Naomi and Ruth deserve some sort of explanation? Some sort of answers? Maybe even the way we might represent God to people. I mean, can you imagine like giving Naomi some answers at this point? So Naomi, it does seem terrible. But 1,100 years from now, it's all going to make sense. You just have to wait a little more than 1,000 years because Jesus is going to be born and David is a good king, and you're going to be kind of related to him. I guess your daughter-in-law will be. And all things work out for good. I mean, you've had conversations like that, right? So here's a question I want to ask this morning. What happens next? This is a really big question because if you've heard any part of Naomi's story, and if you've thought, I've been there, I've been frustrated with God. I've been disappointed at how things turned out, or I've been frustrated at life. If you've ever felt any of these things, like I have, then you know what the question you're asking is. This is a question that burns through your heart. It is simple, nagging, and loud. The question is simple. What does God do about this? If you've sat where Naomi is sitting, you've asked this question. What does God do, and how does he do it? So let's just jump right back into the story of Ruth. We're in the 2nd chapter, and I want you to pay careful attention to what God does. I want you to keep your eyes open for the things that God does to change the story around. This is Ruth chapter 2. I'll read the first 5 verses. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I can find favor." Naomi said to her, Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field that belonged to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. And Boaz asked the overseers of the harvest, "Who does that young woman belong to?" All right, so that's basically the scene that we're looking at this morning. And let me point out a couple things. The first thing I want to point out, and this is really, really important, verse 1. So you can go back a slide. The whole thing about Boaz being related to Naomi, who's from the same tribe of Naomi, being a good guy, that is the voice of the narrator. It's like any other story or a book or a movie where the audience gets to know a secret. And it is a detail that the characters in the story have no idea about. And what's really cool in stories like this is that the audience, the readers, you, start putting the pieces of the story together, and the characters have no idea what's going on. And it seems like Naomi and Ruth have no idea of the things that you know from verse 1. But Naomi's wrong. She's not alone. She actually has a relative, a distant relative, a man who, in Hebrew it says, a man of standing, which has all this significant tied to it, ideas of power and wealth and strength and ability and good characters. And you even get to know his name, Boaz. But Ruth and Naomi don't even know he exists. So verse 2 picks up the story right where chapter 1 leaves off. We have the narrator has just let you in on a secret about Boaz? But verse 2 picks us up in the story with Ruth the Moabite. And also, you probably noticed this too. You should probably be on a first name basis with Ruth by now. You probably don't need the Moabite after her name. There's not that many Ruths in the Bible, but the narrator's underlining what you already know. Ruth is a foreigner. She's an alien. She is a class of a person who is generally despised. And you should know this too. The Jewish law, and I didn't put this in your notes. You may want to write down Deuteronomy 24:19 through 22. But you should know the Jewish law had a special form of social security or welfare for the poor, for the foreigner, for the widow, the orphan. Basically, it went like this. If you were a foreigner or if you were a disadvantaged person, farmers were required to leave some extra food for you as they harvested. And they could only really take one pass at a field, and widows, people who were poor, people who were orphans or widows could go back in and harvest. You should know that, but you should also know this. Doing that was really hard. So if you were a farmer, they actually divided the whole tasks by gender. So you'd have men, and a team of men, you could read about this, they'd crouch down, and they would bend down, and they would cut little bundles of wheat with a small stone sickle. And they just leave it, and the women would come behind, and they'd pick it up, and they'd bundle it. But Ruth, I don't know if you noticed this, Ruth does both jobs, the man's job and the woman's job. And if you're a widow like Naomi or Ruth, you would go in the field behind these teams of harvesters, and they would do both things. And I want you to picture this. Picture Ruth bending down, collecting individual stalks of grain in the hot spring sun. This is Ruth. She's unthanked, unprotected, all by herself. And remember, Ruth could have, as Naomi pleaded with her, she could have gone back to live in Moab with her parents. But this picture here, this hard work on the behalf of others, this is what chesed love looks like. We've already talked a lot about living in community. We've talked about really what loyal covenant chesed love feels like on the inside, in our hearts. And it's complicated. But on the outside, when it comes down to what you do with your hands, love is surprisingly simple. This is such a beautiful picture we have here. Ruth does and is doing, the rest of Ruth, something for her mother-in-law on that warm spring morning in 1100 BC. Ruth is helpful. Paul Miller puts it this way. I love this quote. He says, "There's not a lot of drama in being helpful, but helpfulness is the fabric of love. Helpfulness," he says, "is chesed in action. It is quietly doing what fits the needs around you." That's actually really hard. It's unnoticed without an awful lot of reward. But that is the picture you should have of Ruth. Now what happens next in this story is maybe one of the most fascinating Hebrew phrases in the book of Ruth. And I find, you can put the next slide up, that phrase right there, "as it turned out." So you should know this. If you go to seminary, Ruth is the book that you translate first in Hebrew class. And I'll never forget, I was at Westminster Seminary, and I was in class translating. We each had to take a verse, and I just happened to get this verse. And there I am. The professor calls me out and says, "Sutter, can you translate this verse?" And here's the problem. The literal translation of this verse goes something like this: "By complete chance, she randomly chanced to be working the field that belonged to Boaz." And I remember I was sitting in class at an academic reformed seminary, and I translated it like that. Literally, as it so happened, she chanced to, and as soon as I said that, I thought, this can't be right. I'm at Westminster Seminary, a premier Reformed seminary, and when you're Reformed, you don't really talk about luck or chance or random stuff. You don't even say potluck. Just kidding. Because we know, right? God is in control of everything. And we believe that nothing just happens. So there I am at Westminster Theological Seminary, and I'm muttering something like, he just happened to, by chance, randomly end up in this field, acting a little embarrassed. But I did anyway, because that's exactly what the Hebrew text says. And the professor just kind of laughed at me for a little bit and said, he made this weird joke, well, maybe whoever wrote the Bible should try and sound more Reformed, is what he said. We all kind of laughed. Because the actual Reformed view of God's sovereignty, and they call it the governance of all things, is that somehow God's control often looks random. God is powerful enough to work in things that seem completely ordinary. And we don't get to see a lot of what God is doing behind the scenes. And this is, I put a paragraph in your notes about this. But this is amazing because it seems like the narrator is giving you this kind of wink. It's only the kind of wink that you could only give from 20/20 hindsight. So yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, right? There's this one guy in the entire planet who's able to help Ruth. And Ruth goes out to work and do the right thing. And she just randomly happens to wander into the one field of the one guy in the entire world who could help her. There's a couple things remarkable, but maybe a couple things. What's fascinating about this is that God is clearly and obviously controlling the events here. I mean, there's no other explanation for what we're going to see in the next several chapters that happens. I mean, this is amazing what God does to turn around this story, to resurrect Naomi's story of losing her life. But here's the part that I don't like. What's amazing about it is that God does it all completely behind the scenes. God is invisible in, most of the book of Ruth. But you'll figure out as you read what happens next is that God has just performed an extraordinary miracle and nobody sees it. In the book of Ruth, God's hand is in all of these things, and nobody sees it. And there's Ruth. Ruth is just doing the hard work of obeying, and God is silent. God isn't helping at all. And just by chance, the text says, and she's randomly working, she ends up in a field of Boaz, the one guy in the planet who could help. And just randomly, the guy shows up, and he's generous and kind. And he randomly, by coincidence, looks in the field and just happens to see Ruth. And then, I mean, think about this, add this up. He randomly asks about her. And the foreman coincidentally knows everything about this woman. And all these details go on until you start wondering, does the word random actually apply to any of this in Ruth? Because by the end of the story of Ruth, I mean, definitely by the time of King David, I mean, definitely by the time we read about this in the Christmas story, there's no room for doubt in the book of Ruth. God's hand is at work in everything. And the people being helped, Ruth and Naomi, even Boaz, they don't get to see God doing anything. But Ruth, Naomi, all they can do is trust God and obey. You know, I think we've all been there, right? All of us have at one point or another become frustrated because we want God to do something. And if I were the narrator, if I were writing this story, I don't know, I'd have God show up in a thunderstorm. or write in the sky with a letter of explanation, "Dear Naomi, here's what's really going on." I'd have a burning bush. I would want something incredible and out of the ordinary because I want everyone to see, I want to see clear evidence that God really is good and that God really is in control. But here we are, Ruth, Naomi, and me. We want to see God do something out of the ordinary, and he doesn't. You know what? God actually does something better than that. God is so powerful that he is able to inject hope, and he is able to turn stories around, and he does it powerfully and in love, and he can do it without anybody seeing what he's doing. And Ruth didn't notice what God is doing. Naomi's not like praising God for what he's doing. But in the story of Ruth, it's remarkable. God just does whatever he wants with such remarkable control over details that all you can do is just add up all the odds of this story happening, scratching your head and going, wow, God is in control. And just walking away in wonder at how powerful God is. How do we understand a God like that? God can give us grace in suffering in ways that we just have no ability to see by ourselves. So what do? I don't know. Maybe we just can't understand it. Maybe all you can do is be like Ruth. Trust God and obey God. I think we should do exactly what Ruth does. And this is such a hard lesson to learn. But it's not a new lesson. I actually love how our Belgic confession puts it. This is Article 13. I put in your handout, and I'm going to read it, but I think it's worth going back and reading it again. This is what our confession says. It says that God's power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that God orders and executes his work in the most excellent and just manner, even when devils and wicked men act unjustly. And as to what he does, surpassing human understanding. We will not curiously inquire into it further than we are capable of. But with the greatest humility and reverence, I love this, we will adore the righteous judgments of God which are hid from us, contenting ourselves that we are pupils of Christ, content to learn only the things which he has revealed to us in his word without going past these limits. The confession says that this belief, this doctrine encourages us. It gives us unspeakable consolation because it teaches us that nothing can happen to you by chance, but by the direction of our most gracious and heavenly Father who watches over us with a paternal care, keeping all creatures under his power. Listen to this. So that not a hair of our heads, for they are all numbered, nor even a sparrow can fall to the ground without the will of our Father, in whom we do entirely trust, being persuaded that he so restrains the devil and all of our enemies that without his will and permission, they cannot hurt us. And therefore, we will reject that damnable error of the Epicureans, which says that God regards nothing but leaves all things to chance. Isn't that comforting? You're going to have to go back and read that again. Just so you know, Epicureans, which might be a new term to some of you, is an ancient Greek philosophy that believes that nothing breaks the cycle of life. Life is completely an unbreakable cycle, and so you might as well just enjoy it. Eat, drink, be merry, because nothing like a God breaks in and changes things. So let me go all the way back to the beginning of the message. Let me try and answer the question that burns in the heart of anyone who finds themselves frustrated because they don't see God work around them. Our question is simple. How does God work around us when we're frustrated? How does God work in us when we're frustrated by the gap between what we believe is true of God and what we see happening in our lives? Well, it seems from Ruth, you put the next slide, it seems that God works behind the scenes in invisible ways, and sometimes in ways that we don't even give God credit for. But God works behind the scenes in invisible ways. But I want you to think about that. I want that to sink in. How would your life change if you really believed that? How would it change this week if you really, really believe that God has a plan and that God is in control and He loves you so much and He's acting around you, but you can't see it? How would that change what you do day to day? I mean, what if you really believe that what God was doing was just bigger than what you could see or understand? How would that impact your life? How would that change you? I mean, I love how our confession puts it. I think that if you really believe that, well, you would begin with the greatest humility and reverence to adore the righteous judgments of God. I think if you really believe that, you would find yourself being a student, a pupil of God's Word. And I think, in addition to that, I think that if you really believed that God is at work behind the scenes in ways that you just can't see, I think that it would give you hope. Because if that's true, it means that even when you can't see what God's doing or understand why He's letting things happen, it means that God is in control somehow. And it means that He still loves you. And I think that if you really believed that God loved you, and that God was powerful and He was at work around us in ways you just can't see, I am convinced that one thing that we would do is we would just start obeying God like a child, like a kid who doesn't understand what their parents are telling them, but they just obey anyway. And I guess I get to see a little bit of what that's like because I'm a dad and I have kids. So I get to actually hear the sad laments of kids bemoaning the injustice of their lives under my governments. So, and you may have seen it. My kids complain. And they say things like, what kind of dad would make their kids suffer by only letting them have 2 cookies during coffee hour? Or it's just not fair. Or poor Jude. Jude this week, it's been terrible. Jude learned how to climb out of his crib, and he loves it. And he has started to pull himself up on this crib and dive headfirst onto the hardwood floor, and it's a rush. And he thinks it's the best thing ever, and he can't figure out why we as his parents think that's a bad idea, and we don't let him do that. And there's lots of stuff he doesn't understand. We have a video monitor. We can see what he's doing, and it talks back to him, and it kind of freaks the kid out. It's funny to watch, and he doesn't understand why his loving parents want him to do what he does, or why his life looks the way it does. And, before I had kids, I never wanted to be that dad who said things like, son, obey me, trust me. I don't got to explain myself to a 1.5-year-old, but I'm that dad. I'll admit it. I think my kid should sleep. I think he should eat. And sorry, Jude, I think you got to stop stuffing a lot of big things up your nose. I mean, I think it's great, but you got to stop. And my kids don't understand. And I think in some ways I know more than they do. And they're mad because they have to take a nap, and they have to eat food, and they have to stop sticking stuff up their nose, but I still love them. And they would just be better off if they obeyed. And as flawed as an analogy that is, because I can't compare myself to God really, but I can compare myself to a kid. Because I have a wise, powerful father. And I don't always know what he's doing or why. And I think when you're a kid and you have a powerful, wise dad, the best thing to do is really simple. I think that if you and I really believe that God works behind the scenes in invisible ways, I think, you know what you'd do? I think you would just trust God, and I think you would obey God, even if you don't have the answers to your questions. And that is exactly what Ruth does. She is faithfully obedient. And the rest of the book, we'll read it, God blesses her in amazing ways. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you that we can trust you as our Father, that you are powerful, that you are loving, that you are so sovereign, that you can work even when we can't see you in action. So, Father, I pray that you would give us the faith of a child, that you would help us to just obey you and just to trust you, even when things begin to fall apart. And Father, I pray that you would, through your gracious Spirit, give us eyes to see some of what you're doing, and that you would give us the faith to praise you for it. Help us to see your power and to speak and sing and meditate on your praises and to give you the glory and honor forever and ever. Amen.